The flight deck crew watches the Spitfire's taxi at 0800 hours on March 7, 1942. Leading seaman Thomas Murphy stands on the flight deck of HMS Eagle as 16 fighters line up for launch, their Merlin engines roaring. Their pilots checking instruments one final time before the most dangerous takeoff they will ever attempt. The Spitfires are not designed for carrier operations. They have no arrestor hooks, no folding wings, no strengthened landing gear. They will take off from Eagle's 460-foot flight deck and fly 400 miles to Malta. And if they run low on fuel or encounter navigation problems or meet German fighters, they will ditch in the Mediterranean because they cannot land back aboard. This is Eagle's 7th ferry run to Malta, delivering the fighters that keep the island's defenses alive. In 5 months, she will make her final run as part of Operation Pedestal, the desperate convoy to save Malta from starvation and surrender. 4 torpedoes from U-73 will send her to the bottom in 8 minutes, taking 160 crew with her. But today, the Spitfires launched successfully, all 16 reaching Malta safely, delivered by a carrier that was never supposed to exist, a ship converted from a Chilean battleship hull in 1920, obsolete before completion, too slow for fleet operations, too small for modern aircraft, yet indispensable in the Mediterranean, where Malta's survival depended on fighters she alone could deliver. HMS Eagle began life as a battleship that Chile never received. In 1911, Chile ordered 2 battleships from British shipyards to match Argentine naval expansion. The dreadnought race that preceded World War I was not limited to European powers. South American nations pursued their own arms races, commissioning ships from European builders. Chile's order went to Armstrong Whitworth on the Tyne. The first battleship, to be named Almirante La Torre, was laid down in November 1911. The second, Almirante Cochrane, was laid down in January 1913. Almirante Cochrane's design called for a ship of 28,000 tons displacement, mounting 10 14-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, capable of 22.5 knots. She was 70% complete when World War I began in August 1914. The Royal Navy, desperate for ships, requisitioned her along with her sister ship. Almirante La Torre was completed as HMS Canada and served in the Grand Fleet. Almirante Cochrane's construction stopped. She sat incomplete on the slipway, a partially built battleship with no clear purpose. By 1918, battleships were abundant. The Royal Navy had dozens. What the Navy lacked was aircraft carriers. The war had demonstrated aviation's value, but purpose-built carriers were rare. The Navy improvised, converting cruisers and liners into crude carriers with wooden flight decks added above existing superstructures. These conversions were unsatisfactory, slow, limited aircraft capacity, poor handling in rough seas. The Admiralty examined the incomplete Almirante Cochrane and saw possibility. The hull was sound. The propulsion machinery could be installed. Instead of completing her as a battleship, she could be converted to a carrier. The design would be experimental. The Royal Navy's first purpose-designed carrier hull, though built on a battleship structure. Construction resumed in 1919. The design called for removing the planned gun turrets and superstructure, extending the hull upward, and installing a full-length flight deck. The resulting ship would have displacement of 22,600 tons, length 607 feet, beam 115 feet. The flight deck would be 460 feet long, barely adequate for the aircraft of the day. Propulsion consisted of 4 steam turbines producing 50,000 horsepower, driving 4 shafts, maximum speed, 24 knots. This was slow for a carrier. Fleet operations in the North Sea or Atlantic required carriers capable of keeping pace with battleships at 25 knots or better. Eagle could not. She was too slow for fleet work, but might be adequate for trade protection or operations in secondary theaters. Aircraft capacity was designed for 21 machines. The hangar deck could accommodate fighters and torpedo bombers of 1920 vintage, but aircraft were growing larger and heavier. By the time Eagle commissioned in February 1924, she was already obsolescent. Newer carriers like HMS Furious were faster and carried more aircraft. Eagle was assigned to Mediterranean Fleet, a secondary posting that reflected her limitations. She served through the 1920s and 30s without distinction. Mediterranean Fleet operations were routine. Exercises, port visits, showing the flag. Eagle participated without problems but without glory. By 1939, she was 20 years old, built on a 30-year-old hull design. and thoroughly obsolete. Her machinery was unreliable. Her speed had degraded to 22 knots. Her aircraft capacity had shrunk as newer aircraft required more space. She could carry perhaps 17 modern aircraft, and even that was optimistic. When World War II began in September 1939, Eagle was in the Mediterranean. She participated in the hunt for German commerce raiders, then returned to routine patrols. Her war was quiet until Italy entered the conflict in June 1940. Suddenly, the Mediterranean became a combat zone. Malta, the British island fortress between Sicily and North Africa, became strategically critical. The island controlled shipping lanes to Libya, where Italian and later German forces fought British forces from Egypt. Malta-based aircraft and submarines interdicted Axis supply lines, sinking merchant ships and tankers faster than they could be replaced. But Malta required supply. The island produced almost no food. Water came from rainwater collection and limited wells. Fuel, ammunition, and aviation gasoline had to be imported. And Malta's air defenses required constant reinforcement. Aircraft were destroyed in combat or by bombing of the airfields. Replacements had to come from outside. The obvious route was from Gibraltar, 1,200 miles west. Convoys could run from Gibraltar to Malta, protected by Royal Navy forces. But the route passed within range of Axis aircraft from Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa. The convoys faced continuous attack. Many ships were sunk. Those that got through often arrived damaged. Malta's supply situation remained critical throughout 1940 and 1941. Aircraft reinforcement presented unique problems. Malta needed fighters to defend against bombing raids and to escort strike aircraft attacking Axis convoys. But fighters could not fly from Britain to Malta. The distance exceeded their range. They could not be delivered by convoy because carriers approaching Malta would be heavily attacked and the fighters could not be offloaded at sea. The solution was the ferry run. Carriers would load fighters at Gibraltar, steam east toward Malta until within range, launch the fighters who would fly to the island. Then the carriers would return to Gibraltar before being caught by Axis air attack. The operation was dangerous but feasible. The critical constraint was carrier availability. Eagle became the primary ferry carrier. Her slow speed and limited capacity made her unsuitable for fleet operations, but adequate for ferry runs. The distance from launch point to Malta was approximately 400 miles, within range of Spitfire and Hurricane fighters with auxiliary fuel tanks. The launch point was east of Algiers, far enough from Sicily that Axis bombers would have warning time insufficient to intercept the carrier before it turned back. The first ferry operation occurred in August 1940. Eagle delivered 12 Hurricane fighters to Malta. The operation succeeded. Over the next 2 years, she would repeat it again and again. Each run carried 12 to 18 fighters. Each run risked submarine attack, air attack, mechanical failure of her aging machinery. Each run was essential to Malta's survival. The ferry operations followed standard procedure. Eagle departed Gibraltar accompanied by destroyers for submarine protection. She steamed east at maximum speed, usually 18 to 20 knots, her engines straining with age. The fighters, typically Hurricanes early in the war and Spitfires later, were loaded at Gibraltar with maximum fuel in internal tanks and auxiliary tanks fitted for the ferry flight. The pilots were RAF, not naval aviators, unfamiliar with carrier operations. The launch was the critical moment. The fighters had to take off from a 460-foot deck with full fuel load. Normal Spitfire takeoff distance was approximately 400 feet. Adding full fuel increased weight from 6,000 pounds to over 7,000 pounds, increasing takeoff distance to almost 500 feet. Eagle's deck was barely long enough. Pilots advanced throttles to full power with brakes locked, released brakes, and accelerated down the deck hoping to reach flying speed before reaching the end. If they didn't, they went into the sea. Most launches succeeded. A few did not. Fighters rolled off the bow and crashed into the Mediterranean, sinking within seconds. The pilots, if they escaped the aircraft, could be rescued by destroyers, but several drowned, trapped in cockpits as the fighters plunged to the bottom. These casualties were accepted as cost of keeping Malta alive. Once airborne, the fighters formed up and flew east following a heading provided by Eagle's navigator. Navigation was by dead reckoning. Fly a compass course for a calculated time based on ground speed. Then look for Malta. If the calculations were correct, the island would appear. If the calculations were wrong, or if headwinds were stronger than forecast, the fighters might miss Malta and run out of fuel over water. Several fighters were lost this way. Pilots frantically calling for bearings as their fuel gauges reached empty. Then silence as engines quit and aircraft ditched. Those who reached Malta landed at Lucca or Tacali airfields, often under air raid conditions. German and Italian bombers attacked Malta's airfields continuously. Fighters arriving from Eagle sometimes flew directly into combat, landing after their first engagement to refuel and rearm. Many were destroyed on the ground within hours of arrival. Malta consumed fighters at unsustainable rates. Eagle kept delivering them. By 1942, Eagle had made multiple ferry runs. She was showing her age. Machinery failures were routine. Her boilers required constant maintenance. Her speed had degraded further. Now barely 18 knots. Her flight deck, battered by thousands of landings and launches over 22 years, was cracked and patched. She should have been retired to training duties or scrapped. Instead, she remained operational because the Mediterranean fleet had no replacement. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean was deteriorating. Axis forces controlled most of North Africa. Their air forces dominated the central Mediterranean. Malta was under siege, bombed daily, running short of food and fuel. A major convoy operation was planned for August 1942. Operation Pedestal. 14 merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and supplies from Gibraltar to Malta, protected by the strongest escort force the Royal Navy could assemble. The escort included 2 battleships, HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, 3 fleet carriers, HMS Victorious, HMS Indomitable, and HMS Eagle, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. This was overwhelming force, but the convoy would face overwhelming opposition. Submarines, torpedo bombers, conventional bombers, and motor torpedo boats operating from Sicily and Sardinia. Intelligence predicted the convoy would suffer heavy losses. The operation proceeded because Malta would starve without it. Eagle was assigned to provide fighter protection for the convoy. Her aircraft, Hawker Sea Hurricanes, were obsolete compared to the Spitfires defending Malta. But they could intercept bombers and force them to higher altitudes where bombing accuracy degraded. Eagle's air group consisted of 16 Sea Hurricanes and 4 Fairey Swordfish for anti-submarine patrol. The convoy departed Gibraltar on August 10th. Eagle steamed with the main force, her fighters flying combat air patrol, her lookouts scanning for periscopes. The passage was routine for the first day. German reconnaissance aircraft shadowed the convoy but did not attack. The Axis forces were assembling for coordinated strikes once the convoy entered the narrows between Sicily and Tunisia. On August 11th at 1305 hours, U-73 detected the convoy. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Rosenbaum commanded the Type 7B submarine, a veteran boat that had sunk multiple Allied ships. He maneuvered into attack position, penetrating the destroyer screen by staying deep and moving slowly to avoid detection by ASDIC. At 1315 hours, he reached firing position, 3,000 meters from Eagle. U-73 carried 14 torpedoes. Rosenbaum selected a spread of 4, aiming for the carrier's center of mass. The torpedoes, G7 type, carried 300-kilogram warheads. They were set to run at 4 meters depth, below Eagle's anti-torpedo bulge, but above the armor belt. Rosenbaum fired. All 4 torpedoes hit. The first struck amidships on the port side. The explosion penetrated the anti-torpedo bulge and flooded 2 boiler rooms. The second hit aft, destroying the port propeller shaft and flooding the stern machinery spaces. The third and fourth hits were close together near the center of the ship, both penetrating into the hull and flooding multiple compartments. Eagle began listing to port immediately. The flooding was catastrophic. Her anti-torpedo protection, designed in the 1920s, was inadequate against modern torpedoes. Water poured into machinery spaces, drowning men trapped below decks. The list increased to 15 degrees within 3 minutes. The crew attempted damage control. Hatches were closed to contain flooding. Pumps were started to counter the list, but the damage was too extensive. 4 separate holes below the waterline. Flooding faster than pumps could handle. The list continued increasing. 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. At 1319 hours, 4 minutes after the torpedo hits, the captain ordered abandon ship. Men scrambled from below decks, climbing ladders as the ship tilted further. Those on the flight deck jumped into the sea. Those in the hangar tried to reach topside, but many were trapped as the list made passages impassable. At 1323 hours, Eagle capsized. She rolled to port. her flight deck disappearing underwater, her bottom now facing the sky. She hung there for perhaps 30 seconds, men sliding off the hull into the water, then slid beneath the surface. The time from torpedo impact to sinking, 8 minutes. The destroyers converged on the survivors. HMS Lefroy, HMS Lookout, and HMS Lightning lowered boats and threw lines to men in the water. The sea was calm. Mediterranean summer conditions, which aided rescue efforts, but many men had gone down with the ship, trapped below decks or pulled under by suction as she sank. Others were too injured to swim or drowned before rescue arrived. The final count, 731 crew rescued, 160 lost. Among the dead was the commanding officer, Captain Lachlan McIntosh, who went down with his ship. Many of the dead were engine room and boiler room crew, drowned at their posts when the torpedoes flooded their compartments. Others were aircraft handlers and maintenance crew trapped in the hangar. U-73 escaped. The destroyer screen had been focused on protecting the convoy and had not detected the submarine's approach. After firing, Rosenbaum took U-73 deep and withdrew. The destroyers dropped depth charges but without specific target. The submarine returned to base, her crew credited with sinking a British carrier. Operation Pedestal continued. The convoy had lost its oldest carrier but retained victorious and indomitable. Both provided fighter cover as the convoy approached Malta. The operation cost was severe. 9 of 14 merchant ships sunk, 1 carrier sunk, 2 cruisers sunk, 1 cruiser badly damaged. But 5 merchant ships reached Malta, including the tanker Ohio carrying critical fuel. The island survived. Eagle's loss was significant but not decisive. She had been obsolete, her aircraft outdated, her speed inadequate, but she had been available, which mattered more than capability. The Mediterranean fleet could replace her with newer carriers after Pedestal, but during the months when Malta's survival hung on narrow margins, Eagle had been essential. Her ferry runs delivered over 250 fighters to Malta between August 1940 and August 1942. These fighters defended the island, attacked Axis supply convoys, and maintained British air presence. Without those deliveries, Malta would have fallen. The island's capture would have secured Axis supply lines to North Africa, potentially changing the outcome of the North Africa campaign. The strategic arithmetic was brutal. Eagle was worth more as ferry carrier than as fleet carrier. Her obsolescence in fleet operations made her expendable for secondary missions. She was sent repeatedly into danger because losing her would be acceptable loss. Unlike newer carriers whose destruction would weaken fleet capability, the crew knew this. They understood their ship was old, slow, and vulnerable. They made the ferry runs anyway, facing submarines and aircraft with a carrier that had inadequate protection and limited defensive capability. Some transferred to newer ships when opportunities arose. Most stayed, developing pride in their obsolete vessel that kept delivering results. The aircraft pilots who flew off Eagle's deck knew the risks. The takeoffs were marginal. The flights were long. The navigation had minimal margin for error. Several pilots died in crashes on takeoff or ditching at sea when they missed Malta. More died in combat after arrival, flying aircraft that had barely reached the island into battle against fresh German and Italian fighters. Their sacrifice kept Malta alive. The irony of Eagle's story is that her obsolescence was her value. A modern carrier would not have been risked on ferry runs. Eagle was risked repeatedly because her loss would not fundamentally weaken British naval capability. She was expendable, and expendable assets get expended. Her sinking in Pedestal was tragedy for her crew, but acceptable loss in the strategic calculus. The convoy reached Malta. That was what mattered. Post-war analysis debated whether Eagle should have been retired before Pedestal. Her machinery was unreliable. Her age made her vulnerable. Newer carriers could have performed her role more safely, but newer carriers were needed for fleet operations in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. Eagle, despite her limitations, was available for the Mediterranean. Availability trumped capability. The conversion from Chilean battleship to British carrier had been experiment in 1920. The experiment produced a ship that never quite fit fleet requirements. Too slow, too small, too limited. But in the Mediterranean from 1940 to 1942, those limitations mattered less than her ability to steam to launch position and fly aircraft to Malta. She succeeded in a role she was never designed for because desperation required using whatever was available. Her crew received minimal recognition. The ship had been old and unglamorous. Her war service was in a secondary theater. She sank without dramatic last stand or heroic resistance. 4 torpedoes. 8 minutes. Gone. The survivors transferred to other ships and continued the war. The dead were listed on casualty rolls and buried at sea. No monuments were erected. No films were made. But the Spitfires she delivered to Malta remained. They fought through 1942, defending the island as Axis bombing campaigns intensified. They remained operational into 1943 as Allied forces invaded Sicily and began the liberation of Italy. The fighters Eagle delivered helped win the Mediterranean campaign, though the carrier that brought them never received credit. At 0800 hours on March 7, 1942, leading seaman Thomas Murphy watched 16 Spitfires launch from Eagle's flight deck. He would watch similar launches on subsequent ferry runs. On August 11th, he was on deck when the torpedoes hit, felt the ship list, climbed to topside as Eagle rolled, and jumped into the Mediterranean. He survived, was rescued by HMS Lefaury, and served the rest of the war on destroyers. He never forgot Eagle, the old carrier converted from a Chilean battleship, too slow for fleet work but fast enough to reach Malta, too small for modern aircraft but large enough to deliver the fighters that kept an island alive. HMS Eagle rests in deep water 50 miles north of Algeria. Her wreck has been located by survey ships. She lies inverted, her flight deck on the bottom, her hull pointing toward the surface. Corrosion has taken much of the structure, but the basic shape remains recognizable. A carrier, converted from a battleship that Chile never received, obsolete before completion, indispensable in the Mediterranean. Sunk while doing the work no other ship could do. 160 men died with her. 731 survived to tell her story. And Malta, the island she helped save, remembers the old carrier that kept delivering fighters when survival depended on aircraft arriving from somewhere, delivered by someone in a ship that was never supposed to be good enough, but somehow was.